I still remember the exact moment the silverware stopped clinking. My boyfriend's father was sitting at the head of the table, one hand wrapped around a glass of red wine, the other gesturing slowly through the air the way people do when they're absolutely certain they're the most informed person in the room. He had been talking about cardiology for 20 minutes. Not to me, exactly. More at me. The way someone lectures a wall they've decided needs educating. And then I said it. Quietly. The way I say most things. I think I understand the field pretty well. I'm the new Chief of Cardiology at Hargrove. The glass he was holding didn't fall. But it came close. To understand how we got to that moment, you have to start about 3 weeks earlier. On a Wednesday evening when my boyfriend came home carrying Thai takeout and that particular look on his face, the one that means he's been rehearsing something in the car. I had just come off a 12-hour shift. My badge was still clipped to my jacket. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of department reports that needed my signature before Friday. I had officially been Chief of Cardiology at Hargrove Medical Center for 11 days. The ink on the appointment letter still felt fresh. My boyfriend set the food on the counter and looked at me with that careful, measured expression. "My parents want to have dinner," he said. "This weekend." I looked up. "Okay, there's just one thing." I set down my pen. In my experience, that phrase never arrives alone. He pulled out 2 plates from the cabinet before he continued. "My dad," he said slowly, "doesn't know what you do." I waited. He turned around. He knows you're a doctor, but he doesn't know your position, your title. I studied him. What exactly does he think I am? My boyfriend had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable. A resident. I stared at him for a long moment. "You told your father I'm a resident." I told him you were still in your training years. He sat down across from me. Which was true. 2 years ago. It's not true now. I know. I leaned back in my chair. How long have we been together? 2.5 years. And for 2.5 years, your father has believed I'm a medical resident. He winced. I kept meaning to correct it. But every time the subject came up, it just felt like it would become this whole thing. And I wanted him to meet you as a person first. I understood what he was saying, even if I didn't entirely agree with the method. In medicine, I had spent my entire career introducing myself by credential first. Chief resident, fellow, attending, chief. The title always arrived before anything else about me. There was something almost appealing about walking into a room as just a person. But still, "Tell me about your father," I said. My boyfriend exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since the parking lot. His father had been a cardiologist himself. 30 years at Hargrove Medical Center, the same hospital where I had just been appointed department head. He had retired 4 years ago. Not entirely by choice, the administration had restructured the senior staff, and he had aged out of the position he'd held for nearly 2 decades. My boyfriend said it carefully, but I understood what it meant. His father had not left on his own terms. He still carried that. He was traditional in the way that particular generation of physicians sometimes becomes traditional, believing that medicine had been better before, that standards had slipped, that young doctors today were technically trained but fundamentally soft. He had strong opinions about women in high-pressure specialties. Not hostile, my boyfriend said, just skeptical, old-fashioned. He believed certain roles required a kind of toughness that he'd never quite seen proven to him by the women he'd worked alongside. I had heard variations of that opinion approximately 400 times in my career. It was practically furniture at this point. "Does he know Hargrove has a new chief of cardiology?" I asked. My boyfriend nodded slowly. He mentioned it once. Said he hoped they'd finally picked someone serious. He said that. His words. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the city moved along without us. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone's dog barked twice and stopped. "All right," I said finally. My boyfriend looked up. "All right, what?" "I'll come to dinner. I'll come as your girlfriend." No titles. He blinked. "You're sure?" "Your father wants to meet a person. I can be a person for one dinner." I picked up my fork. "But I'm not going to lie if he asks me directly." My boyfriend nodded immediately. "Of course not. I wouldn't ask that." He paused. "He probably won't even bring up work that much." I smiled a little. Neither of us believed that. His parents lived about 40 minutes north of the city. In one of those older suburbs where the houses are large and well-maintained, and the driveways are lined with oak trees that have been there longer than anyone living on the street. We drove up on a Saturday afternoon, late October, the trees just beginning to let go of their leaves in the way New England trees do reluctantly, and all at once. My boyfriend was quiet for most of the drive. I watched the highway give way to smaller roads, then winding residential streets. "He's going to ask you questions," my boyfriend said, about 10 minutes out. "That's fine. He asks a lot of questions. It's not personal." "I know." He glanced over. "You really aren't nervous." "I've presented research to a room full of department chairs who hadn't slept in 3 days and were looking for something to criticize," I said. "I think I can handle lunch." He smiled at that, and some of the tension left his shoulders. His parents' house was a colonial with dark green shutters and a neatly raked front yard. There were bird feeders hanging from the maple tree near the porch, 3 of them, carefully maintained. I noticed them because details like that tell you something about a person. Someone had been taking care of those feeders for a long time. The front door opened before we reached the porch steps. My boyfriend's father was not what I had exactly pictured, and also precisely what I had pictured. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with white hair kept short, and a posture that still carried 30 years of professional authority in it. He had the steady, evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to making fast assessments. Physicians develop that look. You either grow into it over time, or you don't, and he had grown into it deeply. "Marcus," he said, gripping my boyfriend's shoulder. Then he looked at me. "And you must be Claire." "I am," I said. "It's good to meet you." His handshake was measured, firm, but not performative. He was sizing me up, which I had expected, and which I didn't take personally. Behind him, my boyfriend's mother appeared with the kind of warm, genuine smile that immediately made the whole house feel easier. She was smaller than I expected, with quick eyes and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades being the steadier half of their household. She hugged Marcus, then turned to me and took both my hands briefly. "We've been looking forward to this," she said, and I believed her. The house smelled like roasting garlic and something with rosemary. The walls in the hallway were lined with framed photographs, family vacations, holiday portraits, and, tucked among them, a few professional ones. My boyfriend's father in surgical scrubs, a team photo outside what I recognized immediately as Hargrove's old cardiology wing before the renovation. He noticed me looking. "Hargrove," he said. 30 years. "I know the building," I said simply. He nodded once. "Marcus says you're in medicine." "That's right. Cardiology?" "Yes." Something shifted slightly in his expression, a small recalibration. He seemed to decide that made me slightly more interesting than he'd expected. "Good field," he said. "Demanding." "It is." My boyfriend's mother steered us toward the dining room before anything more could develop in that direction. The table was already set. There was a small dish of olives in the center, a basket of bread, and the kind of careful table setting that means someone spent real time on it. Lunch began easily enough. My boyfriend's mother asked about my drive, about the neighborhood where we lived, about a trip we'd taken to Portugal earlier that year. My boyfriend's father mostly listened at first, eating methodically, occasionally asking a clarifying question. He was civil. Genuinely civil. Which mattered. Whatever his opinions, he hadn't decided to be openly rude. He was observing. It was about 40 minutes in, when the main dishes had been cleared and the conversation had wandered naturally toward medicine, that things began to shift. My boyfriend's father set his wineglass down carefully. "How long have you been in your residency?" he asked. My boyfriend stiffened almost imperceptibly beside me. "I finished my residency a while back," I said calmly. "And my fellowship." His father nodded. "Cardiology fellowship is brutal. Hopkins? Mass General? Cleveland Clinic." He seemed to approve of that. "Good program. Rigorous." He paused. "So you're attending now?" I didn't correct him further. "Not yet." "And where are you practicing?" he asked. "Hargrove," I said. A brief silence. He studied me. "Hargrove is a serious institution," he said finally. "Competitive staff." "It is." He leaned forward slightly, in the manner of someone preparing to share something important. "You know, the cardiology department there went through some difficulty after I left. Leadership gaps. The administration brought in someone from outside for a while, but from what I hear through colleagues, it never quite stabilized." My boyfriend's mother looked at her water glass. My boyfriend picked up a piece of bread and didn't eat it. Medicine today, my boyfriend's father continued, has some real structural problems, particularly at the department level. People advance for the wrong reasons. He paused. Political reasons. Institutional optics. I kept my expression neutral. What do you mean by that? He seemed pleased to be asked. He sat back. Hospitals now are very focused on how things look from the outside. Diversity, initiatives, publicity, all well-intentioned, but the result is that you sometimes see people elevated before they've really demonstrated the experience required. Marcus set down his bread. Cardiology especially, his father said. It's not a field that forgives inexperience. The margin for error is narrow. He looked at me with what I think he believed was mentorship in his expression. That's something they don't always communicate clearly in training programs now. How much weight you're actually carrying when you're in that chair. I understand the weight, I said quietly. He nodded in the tone of someone who assumes agreement and presses forward. When I was at Hargrove, I built that department from a 12-person team to nearly 40. Built the cath lab, the structural heart program. A small pause, the kind that precedes something being said for the benefit of a particular audience. It takes years of that kind of work to really understand what department leadership requires. Not just clinical skill, administrative stamina, political navigation, the ability to make hard calls when the institution wants something easier. My boyfriend said, quietly, "Dad, I'm not lecturing," his father said. He glanced at me. "I'm trying to give some context. Medicine is different when you're inside the infrastructure of it." "I agree," I said. He nodded again. "Young physicians today are technically excellent. I won't dispute that. But there's a certain kind of judgment that only comes from time and from consequence." He held my gaze steadily, from having made the call that mattered and lived with the outcome. My boyfriend's mother touched her napkin to her lips and then set it beside her plate with the careful movement of someone preparing for something. Her husband continued, "I say this not to discourage anyone. I say it because I think honest mentorship is actually rare now, and people early in their careers benefit from hearing it plainly." He looked at me again, with the steady warmth of a man who genuinely believed he was doing me a service. "The field rewards patience, longevity. You build credibility over time. There are no shortcuts to that kind of authority." The table was quiet. I placed my hands lightly on the edge of the table. "I think you're right about most of that," I said. He settled back, satisfied. "The weight of the position is real. And clinical skill alone isn't sufficient. You do need to understand the institution, the staff, the decisions that follow you home at night." He nodded. "That's something I've been thinking about a lot since I took over the department." He looked at me. I held his gaze. "I'm the new Chief of Cardiology at Hargrove." The room did not make a sound. Not the refrigerator, not the wind outside, not the small clock on the shelf above the sideboard. My boyfriend's mother sat perfectly still. My boyfriend was looking at the table with an expression that was equal parts dread and relief. His father's face went through several things in rapid succession: confusion, then recalculation, then something that looked, beneath everything else, like the specific embarrassment of a man who had just heard himself played back. He said nothing for a long moment. "Chief of Cardiology," he repeated. His voice had lost its instructional quality entirely. "Yes. At Hargrove. Yes. I started 6 weeks ago." Another silence. He looked at his son. Marcus met his father's eyes briefly, then looked away. "You knew," his father said. Marcus said carefully, "I wanted you to meet her first." His father absorbed that. Then he looked back at me. He had the controlled expression of a man who had spent decades managing his reactions in high-stakes rooms, but underneath the control, I could see something else, the particular discomfort of a person reviewing, sentence by sentence, everything they'd said in the last hour. "The leadership gap you mentioned," I said gently. "That was real. The transition was difficult. I spent the first 2 weeks doing back-to-back department reviews just to understand where things stood." He looked at me steadily. "You're serious?" "I am." A pause. "How old are you?" he asked. Not unkindly. More like someone trying to recalibrate a map they thought they understood. 32. He said nothing. But something shifted in the line of his shoulders. It wasn't anger. It was the slow, arriving weight of recognition. My boyfriend's mother reached over and refilled her husband's water glass, even though it was nearly full. It was the kind of thing you do when you need your hands to be doing something. Well, she said, with the measured composure of a woman who had clearly navigated many of these moments over many decades. That puts a certain amount of this conversation in a different light. Her husband gave a short, humorless sound. That's a generous way to put it. I thought so, she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at me with an expression that was stripped of its earlier confidence, just a man. Now, sitting at his own table, looking at the person he'd been addressing as though she were a student. I owe you an apology, he said. You don't have to. I spent the better part of an hour, he continued, with the deliberateness of someone who prefers to finish difficult things once they've started them, explaining cardiology to the Chief of Cardiology at my former hospital. A beat. I think I do have to. My boyfriend exhaled audibly. His mother looked at her husband with something that might have been pride. I looked at him. You weren't trying to be unkind, I said. You were talking about something you care about deeply. That doesn't excuse talking down to someone. No, I agreed. But it explains it. He studied me for a moment. Something in his expression shifted again, not embarrassment now, but curiosity. The kind of look that appears when a person has finished being embarrassed and started being genuinely interested. Cleveland Clinic Fellowship, he said slowly. And then straight to attending at Hargrove? Associate attending for 2 years. Then the position opened. Who was your fellowship director? I told him. He nodded slowly. He knew the name. She's rigorous, he said. She is. She was also the reason I chose that program. A small silence, but a different kind of silence than before. The structural heart program I built, he said, more carefully now. How much of it is still intact? The foundation is solid. We expanded it last year, added robotic-assisted valve repair. He raised his eyebrows slightly. That was pending approval when I left. It cleared about 8 months after you retired. The committee pushed it through the following spring. He nodded slowly. I heard rumors about that, but nothing confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. How's the team? And just like that, the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. We talked about the department for the next 20 minutes. Not as teacher and student, as 2 cardiologists who happened to know the same institution from different angles, different eras. He knew things about Hargrove's early history that weren't in any written record I'd found. I knew things about where the department was going that he'd had no way of knowing. We filled in each other's gaps without either of us deciding to. My boyfriend sat back in his chair and watched us with the quietly stunned expression of a man who had braced for a collision and instead witnessed something else entirely. His mother caught his eye from across the table and gave him the small, satisfied look of someone who had suspected all along that things would land somewhere worth landing. After the table was cleared, my boyfriend helped carry dishes to the kitchen. His mother followed with the serving bowls. His father and I stayed at the table for a moment. The conversation settled into a quieter register. He turned his wine glass slowly in his hand. I want to say something. All right. What I said earlier about institutional optics, about people being elevated for the wrong reasons. He looked at me directly. I meant it generally, but I said it in a direction that wasn't fair. I understood what you meant. That's part of what bothers me. He set the glass down. You understood, and you sat with it. You didn't correct me. He paused. You just let me keep going. You weren't entirely wrong about the landscape, I said. Some of what you described is real, but not you. I don't think so, but I'm probably not the most objective judge of that. He almost smiled at that. That's a careful answer. I've learned to be careful with certain questions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my daughter-in-law shouldn't have to sit through that. Whatever's fair to say about the landscape. I noticed, he said, daughter-in-law. My boyfriend and I had talked about marriage, but not formally, not yet. His father used the word like it was already decided. I wasn't sure if he'd meant to. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. When I was talking all of it, the department history, the leadership speech, he paused. Was any of it useful? Or was it entirely a waste of your time? I considered the question honestly. The part about political navigation, I said. The way you framed institutional stamina. That was useful. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I haven't heard it said that plainly. He looked at me. You're being generous. I'm being honest. I don't have time to be generous. He let out a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. No, I imagine you don't. My boyfriend appeared in the doorway. He looked between us. Everything okay? We're fine, his father said. He glanced at me briefly. We're talking. My boyfriend retreated back toward the kitchen with visible relief. His father leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they're organizing something internally. I retired on bad terms, he said finally. I know. Marcus mentioned it. He glanced at me. What did he say? That it wasn't entirely your choice. He nodded once. The administration wanted to restructure. I was 58. I'd been in that chair for 17 years. They were polite about it. He paused. But I understood what polite meant. He was quiet for a moment. I think I've spent the last 4 years being angrier about that than I realized. And some of that anger has looked like opinions about how medicine has changed. I listened without interrupting. It's easier, he continued, to believe the field declined after you left than to believe the field simply continued without you. He looked at me. That's a hard thing to admit. It is, I said. You're the continuation, he said. Not bitterly, just plainly. Part of it, I said. You built a lot of what I'm working with. He was quiet for a long moment. I hadn't thought about it that way. The cath lab you mentioned. The structural heart program. Those didn't disappear when you retired. I walked into them. I'm using them every day. I paused. That's not nothing. His jaw moved slightly. He looked down at the table. My fellowship director used to say, I continued, that the best sign a mentor ever built something real is when they stop being able to see where their work ends and the next generation's begins. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, She sounds like she knows what she's talking about. She does. My boyfriend's mother appeared in the doorway. She looked at her husband with the soft, knowing expression of someone reading a room they've spent decades learning to read. Coffee? She asked. Please, I said. He looked up at his wife. Yes. And then he added in a quieter voice. Thank you. She nodded once and disappeared back into the kitchen. In that small exchange, I understood a great deal about their marriage. We had coffee in the living room. The conversation moved into easier territory, the hospital's new North building, a conference I was attending in December, a paper his former colleague had recently published that he'd read twice and disagreed with. I had also read it and disagreed with it, and we spent 15 minutes being in precise agreement about exactly what was wrong with the methodology. My boyfriend sat beside me on the couch and said almost nothing, which I think was the wisest thing he could have done. Before we left, his father walked us to the door. He shook my boyfriend's hand. Then he turned to me. Claire, he said. Yes. He looked at me with the expression of a man who was choosing his words more carefully than he had all afternoon. I hope you'll come back. I'd like that. He nodded. I have 30 years of opinions about that department that no one has wanted to hear since I retired. A pause. Some of them might even be useful. I smiled. I'll take you up on that. He looked slightly surprised, as though he'd expected politeness rather than sincerity. Then he nodded again, a different kind of nod. More considered. More equal. My boyfriend's mother hugged me at the door. She held on for just a moment longer than a first meeting usually calls for. Come back soon, she said. And then, quietly, close to my ear, thank you for being patient with him. I squeezed her hand. In the car, my boyfriend didn't say anything for a full 5 minutes. He drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, watching the road. Finally, he said, I'm sorry. You don't need to be. I should have told him before. Maybe, but I think tonight worked out better this way. He glanced over. How do you figure that? I looked out at the trees passing in the dark. Because he didn't get a chance to decide who I was before he met me, he had to revise his opinion in real time. That's harder, but it sticks better. He was quiet for a moment. You were never actually worried. I was a little worried. About what? I thought about it. That he'd be the kind of person who doubles down. Who gets defensive when he realizes he was wrong and just gets louder to cover it. I paused. He wasn't that. He was embarrassed. And then he was honest about being embarrassed. That's rarer than people think. My boyfriend nodded slowly. He called me that night, after you left with your residency story and I left for the bathroom. I figured. He didn't know I'd gone back to tell them you were done with residency. He said you seemed unusually composed for someone in training. What did you say? I said that's just how she is. He smiled faintly. I wasn't wrong. I looked out the window at the city beginning to reappear on the horizon. The lights of the highway, the familiar skyline, the particular kind of quiet that settles inside a car when two people have nothing left to prove to each other. 3 weeks later, my boyfriend's father called my office line. My assistant put him through with a slightly puzzled look, which I resolved not to explain. He got directly to the point, the way retired surgeons tend to do. He had a former resident talented, now mid-career, hitting a wall politically at his current institution, who needed advice from someone currently inside the system. Would I be willing to speak with him? As a favor? I said yes. We set up the call for the following week. After I hung up, I sat for a moment at my desk. Outside my window, the hospital campus moved along in its ordinary rhythm maintenance crews, laundry carts, a family walking slowly toward the entrance with the particular heaviness that means they're heading to the cardiac floor. Someone I was responsible for. There's a version of that afternoon at his parents' house that ends loudly, where I correct him the first time he says something presumptuous, where I announce my title as a kind of weapon, a silencing device, where the satisfaction of the moment is sharp and quick and done. I understand that impulse. I have felt it. In training, I felt it constantly, every conference room where I had to introduce my credentials twice before they registered. Every senior colleague who addressed questions to the man beside me, every performance review that praised my clinical judgment and then suggested I work on being more assertive, simultaneously. But I have also learned, over time, that the sharpest response and the most useful response are often two different things. You can end a conversation, or you can change it. Most of the time, only one of those options matters the day after. What I wanted from that dinner was not a victory. I wanted a father-in-law. That's still what I'm working toward. It takes longer than an afternoon. But the afternoon was a start. And sometimes a start is the thing that matters most. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the quiet response often carries more weight than the loud one, that patience is a form of strength and not a form of surrender. Share it with someone who might need to hear that today. And if you're interested in stories about life, work, and the small moments where everything quietly shifts, I hope you'll stay around, because those moments are everywhere, if you know where to look.